Thank you all so much. Thank you for the introduction. And a big thank you to Liz and the organizing committee for putting on another incredible event. Can we have a round of applause for Liz and everyone involved? Thank you. Thank you. Now, I want to start by sharing a story with you all. It's 2006, the middle of the night in the summer, and alongside some of my closest and most trusted friends, I'm cutting through the fences of this military research facility. This night has been months in the planning. We know that the other side of the fences is this herd of goats being used for deep diving experiments for the Royal Navy. These goats are forced into decompression chambers and subjected to what divers call the bends until their bodies are disfigured and their minds are broken. We've been over the fences several times already. We've located the goats, we've befriended them, we've taught them to let us put harnesses on them and lead them around for pieces of apple. The biggest and most inquisitive goat, we've even named him Big Dave. So as we cut through the fences, we run across this area of grass, we get to where we know the goats are going to be. And then 2 by 2, we start putting on the harnesses and leading them across a golf course to a patch of woods where a friend is waiting, ready to load them into a van. And the first 2 goats come out, everything's perfect. 4 goats out, 6 goats out, everything is going to plan until I'm leading the 8th goat out of this facility. And suddenly 3 kids on BMXs appear in front of me, about 10 meters away. And for an awkward moment, they stare at me and I stare at them. Me wondering why these teenagers are out in the middle of the night. Them presumably wondering why a strange man in a balaclava is walking a very peculiar looking dog on a piece of string. And suddenly, after this awkward interaction, this goat, she looks up, she looks these kids dead in the eye and lets out the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. I don't know if you've ever heard a goat scream, but they do not sound like dogs. So these kids took one last look at us, horrified looks at us. They turned and they vanished into the night as fast as their bikes could carry them. And suddenly we had a problem. How long did we have? How many minutes did we have before they went home, told their parents, told the police? We had 8 goats ready to be saved, and we could not jeopardize them by carrying on. I took this 8th goat back to my friends. We loaded her up. But I told them there was no way I was leaving without going back for Big Dave. So I sprinted back to the hole. I located Big Dave. I put the harness on. I led him to the hole in the fence. I led him to his freedom. But the second he got out of that hole, all he wanted to do was eat every leaf, tree, piece of grass, flower he could lay his mouth on. We got about 5 meters in as many minutes, and it became very clear there was no way I was going to be able to get Dave across the golf course in time to make a safe getaway. Reluctantly, I had to make the heartbreaking decision to turn around, to lead Dave back through the hole, back to his fate. And in doing so, I was able to pick up a much smaller, more compliant goat and run with her as fast as I could back to the waiting van, slap the van on the back and watch it go off into the night, the road to freedom. And my friends and I, we jogged back towards our getaway car, a bittersweet feeling that we'd had to abandon halfway through. And suddenly our radio burst into life that we had another problem. The police were directly behind the van. They were following it at every turn it made. When the van turned left, the police car turned left. If the van turned right, so did the police car. We slowed down, fearing that when we got back to our getaway vehicle, the police would be there waiting. But somehow they weren't. We got in, we started driving, another call on the radio. It was all clear. The police had miraculously pulled away. The van was on the motorway. These 9 goats were on their way to freedom. An amazing, amazing end to their story, that they got to live out their lives in freedom. But for us, this was just a beginning. Because yes, we'd saved 9 lives that night, but we'd had to leave 22 behind. And even the ones we saved, we knew were going to be replaced. And so the next morning, we press released our action. A slightly different headline if you were at Seoul's talk and you saw the liberation that they got, or the headlines they got for the liberations back in the 80s. They called us extremists, that we'd grabbed these goats. But the paper they wrote or they ran an opinion poll of their readership down in Portsmouth, Gosport, where this action happened, asking their readership how many people thought we had done the right thing. 99% of the respondents agreed that we had done the right thing in liberating these goats, that breaking into this research facility was the right thing to do. We had the public support. And so we launched a pressure campaign. And week after week, we protested outside the facility. We announced their sister sites, other secondary targets, encouraging other activists across the UK to get involved. And we contacted our local MP, who fortunately was sympathetic, and he raised this question in Parliament, again, week after week, as we embarrassed them on the streets. He embarrassed the MOD in front of their peers and politicians in Parliament. We deep dived the scientific research, no pun intended, and we uncovered that every other navy in the world, or virtually every other navy at least, had scrapped these tests in favor of human, effective, future-facing, computer-based models. And so, after a few months of this campaigning, we got the incredible news that the MOD was suspending these tests pending an internal investigation, a review of whether these tests should carry on. But this still wasn't enough for us. A review was not enough. We needed these tests to end. And so we increased our pressure, we increased our protests, we increased the political pressure. And within a year of us starting the pressure campaign, within a year of the liberation of those goats, the MOD announced they were going to stop these tests altogether. We ended the test, but still we hadn't quite won. There were still these 22 goats living in purgatory inside this facility. And so once more we escalated, demanding the release of those goats to us or any other suitable third party. And shortly after, as we applied our pressure and we brought in the pressure of the local media, we got that incredible news that these 22 goats were being freed in a secret operation in the middle of the night to Buttercup Goat Sanctuary in Kent, where they got to live out their natural lives free from human oppression. And knowing I was giving this talk today, I actually drove past this facility a week or so ago to get these photos. And this is what the facility looks like today: decaying, decrepit, destroyed, and most importantly, as every research facility abusing and oppressing animals should be, as every institution of oppression should be, empty. As the goats were freed to Buttercup Goat Sanctuary, myself and my best friend and the campaign co-founder Nicola, we went to visit the goats, the 22 that we'd had to leave behind. And I'm delighted to say that here is Big Dave, reunited on the right side of the fence, an incredible moment for me, and I'm sure a much more incredible moment for him. Now, the reason I wanted to share this story is because everything I have just described, from the liberation, through the pressure campaigning, the scientific research, the political lobbying, the suspension of the test, the end of the test, the closure of the laboratory, the freedom of these goats, all of that was the work of two people, a handful of volunteers, and no external funding. So what I want you just to consider for a moment, everybody in this room, I want you just to consider, what might we have achieved in this moment? What could this victory have been a catalyst for had we had the combined strength and weight, resources and power of the contemporary animal freedom movement? We know that the test would have been ended. We know the goats would have been freed. We know the laboratory would have closed, because that's what happened. What more could we have done if we'd had all of our weight? Everyone we know outside of this room have been able to pull behind this victory. What could we have dared to demand, ask for, and achieve? government inquiry into the efficacy and ethics of animal testing, perhaps. An end to all military research, perhaps an end to testing on animals itself. Because make no mistakes, these are the kind of demands we can make, the kind of victories we can have when we dare to work together. And for me, that's one of the most incredible things about this event, is the feeling of hope I get when I leave. Seeing so many different individuals and organizations getting together, communicating, collaborating, strategizing, and dare I say, conspiring to make tomorrow better than today. And last year, I was fortunate enough after VARC to be invited by my dear friend and colleague, Leila Kassam, and also Natalie Brain, to an organizer's event, a meeting, I suppose, of different organizers from across every facet of our movement, with this idea in mind to discuss ideas of where there might be space for collaboration, whether there's an appetite for that kind of collaboration. It was just one of many such convenings that have been taking place over the last year or so, looking into this idea. And it seeded this idea in Natalie and Leila that maybe there was an opportunity, or maybe there could be an opportunity to put this theory into practice. And that opportunity came for them following the events Rose mentioned in her talk just now, the events of Animal Justice Project and Animal Rising, investigating the RSPCA assured welfare washing scheme last year. Specifically, one story that came out of these investigations, amongst all of the horror, all of the unimaginable horror, came this one story of hope. The story of a pig named Charlie, who was identified by the rescue, or by the investigation team from Animal Rising, clinging on for life in urgent need of veterinary care, and her rescuers took her to freedom. They gave her the care and love she would never have received with the RSPCA, with that welfare washing assured scheme. And they nursed her back to health and gave her the opportunity to live a life of freedom. And so Natalie and Leila and others decided that maybe there's an opportunity here to start capitalizing on the story of Charlie, or to work around the story of Charlie, to see if there was an appetite for unity within our movement, to campaign for the animals on every RSPCA assured farm, to convince the RSPCA to disassociate from this welfare washing scam, and to stand up for what they claim to stand up for. To fight for these animals, to secure the freedom for these animals, to secure freedom for Charlie. And out of that, the For Charlie campaign was born. It was an initiative aimed to unify a movement. It was an initiative that was incredibly successful because there is an appetite in our movement for this kind of collaboration. People want to be working together because we want to succeed. And as a result, an open letter to the RSPCA was signed by 250 notable individuals and organizations from every single corner of our movement, with one shared demand that the RSPCA disassociate from the assured scheme. We saw organizations sitting down and deciding when the best time might be to release their next investigation. We saw people sitting down to decide when strategically amongst those investigations might be the best time for senior RSPCA officials to resign their positions. And amongst this collaboration of so many organizations with this one shared vision, just like the vision Rose was discussing earlier, we saw success after success as the RSPCA removed all meat recipes from their website, as they investigated and expelled farms and slaughterhouses from their scheme, as they scrapped all catering of meat at their internal events, and then the CEO of the RSPCA resigned. An incredible moment from that collaboration, but what unfortunately that meant is the RSPCA now no longer have anyone in the position of power required to make the decision that is being demanded of them by us. But nonetheless, what was demonstrated by this cross-movement collaboration, by all of you that were involved in that collaboration, is that when we go from forcing organizations like the RSPCA to go from stamping out these pockets of fire as they spring up, to having to face the full inferno that our movement can be when we dare to unite, then we hold within us an incredible power that is so much greater than the sum of our parts. And so this kind of collaboration is essential if we want to see true progress within our movement. If we want to be an effective movement, we have to learn to work together. And that isn't always easy, and it's not always comfortable. And I'm very aware of this, and I find myself often in positions where I have to collaborate with people and work with people that I find uncomfortable. And when I am in those positions, I remind myself of a story, of a moment in social justice history that probably inspires me more than any other. And it's a moment I want to share with you. So does anyone here know who these people are, either collectively or as individuals? So there are 3 Black Panthers in this picture, and they were indeed the catalyst of what happened here. But the collective group here became known as the Rainbow Coalition. And yes, it was the brainchild of Fred Hampton and Bobby Lee, the Chicago organizers of the Black Panther Party. And in 1969, as humans took our first steps on the moon, these men were making a giant leap for social progress, because Bobby Lee and Fred Hampton identified that many of the issues they faced in their community weren't just issues of race, it were issues of class. The same boot that ground their community into the dirt was doing the same to every working class community in Chicago. So they decided to launch this coalition, and they reached out to these 2 men at the back who were local organizers of the Young Lords, a Latinx street gang that had reformed into a social justice campaign seeking Latinx representation across Chicago. That in itself, I think many of us agree, is a very sensible and pragmatic step to make in building unity. What happened next, I feel, is truly remarkable and the lesson we all need to learn. The other 2 men in this picture, organizers of a group called the Young Patriots. Now, the Young Patriots were 2nd-generation Appalachian farmers who had moved into Chicago, promised a life of plenty in the city, only to find themselves facing homelessness and joblessness. They were an organization consisting entirely of white, for want of a better word, rednecks. Their logo was the Confederate flag. Amongst their numbers were overt and out racists. Bobby Lee and Fred Hampton, despite that, sat down with these men and laid out their vision, explaining that they felt they had more in common than that divided them, that if they worked together, they could be a true force for change in Chicago, to change the culture of class war, of the upper class stamping down on the working class. Remarkably, these 2 men agreed. And from that moment on, every time the Black Panthers in Chicago gave a talk, the Young Patriots stood by the side. When the Young Patriots called a press conference, the Black Panthers would be there in solidarity. The Young Patriots became an anti-racist organization. And this form of collaboration, this cross-movement collaboration, was so effective, was so powerful, that the FBI shot Fred Hampton dead on his doorstep, killing him and tragically killing the Rainbow Coalition. But it did not kill the idea. This method of cross-unity organizing in Chicago continues to this day to be a staple of organizing in that city. And what these men did meant, as a direct result of this collaboration, 20 years after this photo was taken, Chicago elected their first Black mayor. So if these men, if these organizations and the people they represent can work together, can learn to adapt who they are, to collaborate, to campaign together, to fight together, to be arrested together, then so long as no one is being harmed, there is nobody in this room or in our movement who cannot do the same. So to be an effective movement, we need to see a level of unity. We need to increase our collaboration, And there's certainly, I've seen this whole weekend, and I'm sure you have too, there's such an appetite in our movement right now for that kind of cross-movement collaboration. The amount of talks I've been to where people have referenced this is truly inspiring. But to be a mass movement, we need to look at how we can recruit ordinary members of the public to become activists. And I think the best way of doing that is to look at history at a time when ordinary people, just like you and I, our families, found themselves in a position where they had to organize or face true life or death situations to them and their communities. So does anyone know who these women might be representing here? Anyone? Well, more, maybe, but they are members of the French resistance, part of the much wider resistance movement to Nazi occupation of Western Europe. And the resistance movement across Europe, as I say, it was founded from the necessity, from people waking up one day, ordinary people with ordinary lives and jobs and interests and hobbies, waking up and suddenly finding themselves having to organize for their freedom, for the freedom of the people they loved, for their communities, for their countries. And so in doing so, they had to adapt quickly. They had to find ways they could organize themselves. They had to step into roles. They had to work out themselves how to do this. There was no one to tell them what to do, because the people that tell you what to do were trying to kill them. And so what they did is they brought whatever skills and knowledge and ideas, strategies, theories of change they might have. They brought them to the table, to their families, their communities, and they used that as a basis of building a local community of resistance. And as a result of that, different towns and cities and regions would have vastly different resistance movements, groups, and cells. Oh, spoiler alert. That went a lot. As an example of this difference between the different resistance cells, on this post we see two different organizations represented. I won't ask you necessarily to answer who they are, but on the left, we have a group that the Nazis dubbed the Army of Crime, a militant organization who are happy to use violence to derail trains and even assassinate German soldiers. On the other side, the Berlin-based White Rose movement, who were advocates, fierce advocates of passive, non-violent resistance, whose activism constituted publishing and disseminating leaflets and brochures, calling for peace, calling for harmony in Europe once more. Now, tragically, every single person in this picture, every person on this slide was arrested, convicted, and beheaded by the Nazi regime for their activism. A poignant reminder, perhaps, that while we often see vast differences between ourselves, those we oppose tend to only divide us by who's effective and who is not. But I really just want to focus a moment on Sophie Scholl, one of the organizers of the White Rose, some of her final words before she met her murder. On the day she was being killed, she wrote this. I'm going to try and get through it. Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us, thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action? Now, tragically, Sophie did not see the end of the war. Tragically, she did not see the liberation of Europe. Following her death, the RAF printed tens of thousands of White Rose pamphlets and dropped them across Berlin in solidarity with the White Rose. And indeed, thousands of people were awakened to action across Europe. 80% of the intelligence used to plan the D-Day landings came from the resistance network. As the well-resourced, well-organized, well-trained Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the community-organized, grassroots resistance organizations and groups and individuals were causing the diversions, delaying supply lines, creating the intelligence picture necessary to secure the liberation of Europe. While the end of the Second World War would not have happened without that well-organized, well-trained, well-structured Allied invasion, it could not have happened without that community organizing of the resistance. And this is a lesson we see in our own movement too. If we look at the history of our movement, every single success we've ever had is a direct result of community-based organizing, combining with well-resourced organizations. Every single one. And to give an example of that, you got the spoiler just now, I want to share a story, one of my favorite stories from our movement. There is a lot of tragedy in it, but it does have a happy ending. The story of Rocky the dolphin. In the 1970s, Rocky was one of 9 dolphins stolen from their home in the wild, kidnapped by humans, and forced to live in a tiny concrete enclosure, forced to perform. The biggest tragedy, really, to me of all this is the other side of that wall is the sea. By 1988, Rocky was the only surviving member of those 9 dolphins originally captured. Forced to live in isolation in Marineland, in Morecambe, he came to the attention of members of the Animal Liberation Front. If you were here last year, you may have heard Mel Broughton telling some of this story. And these people, Barry Horn, Mel Broughton, and their friends, they decided that this was not okay. They decided they were going to take Rocky over that wall and give him the freedom he deserved. And so, just like we did many years later with the goats in the military research facility, they went over the wall and they made friends with Rocky, night after night. They had a plan. So on the night in question, they went in to execute their plan. But as they were soaking a stretcher that they intended to use to lift him over the wall, they were spotted by a cleaner in a nearby hotel, who called the police and had every single person arrested. Rocky was forced to stay in custody. However, that was not the end of Rocky's story. In many ways, that was just the beginning, because perhaps unsurprisingly, this attempt to liberate a dolphin made international headlines. And it energized the grassroots, community-based section of our movement into organizing local protests at sea life centers, dolphinarium, aquariums across the UK. This one here in Windsor. Is anyone here in this picture? No, seemed unlikely. But across the UK, there was protests like this, energized by the story of Rocky the dolphin, demanding the release of every dolphin in custody in the UK. Back in Marineland at Morecambe, these local protests were led by a woman called Bev, and her energy and her passion created mass public support for what they were doing. It drew the attention of international NGOs, including Born Free Foundation, and they united with Bev to create an initiative called Back to the Blue. And the Back to the Blue initiative led in 1991 to the release of Rocky and 2 dolphins from Brighton back into the seas of the Caribbean. Back to freedom. Yes, please. Rocky's freedom would not have been possible without the grassroots, community-based organizing, that bottom-up organizing, that local pressure, combining with the grass tops, with the NGOs. Rocky would have died in prison had it not been for that collaboration. So I want to talk briefly about how we can build this kind of grassroots movement we need. Because in 1992, we saw over 20,000 people mobilize in a mass protest against animal testing in London, the largest anti-animal testing protest we've seen in the history of our country. And that was because at that time we had an estimated 300 local community-based organized animal freedom groups. So how can we build that back, and how can we make it stronger? What can we do to ensure that there are victories like the liberation of Rocky, become normal again in our movement? How do we ensure that the end of dolphinariums, and I should add that 2 years after the release of Rocky, the last dolphinarium in the UK closed its doors for good. We have no more dolphins in captivity in this country because of what the ALF, the grassroots organizing, the NGOs did for Rocky. So how do we make that normal? How do we make that an everyday occurrence in our movement, that we get these victories again and again and again, and we don't have to wait years between them? How do we build that grassroots support so that's possible? And I'm going to start that by focusing on the NGO sector, on the funded sector of our movement, because without these local groups, without this community-based organizing, there is no base of our movement. When we need any kind of mass mobilization, whether it's a protest, whether it's a petitioning, writing letters to your MP, any kind of mobilization requires people. It requires people power. Everyone benefits. The NGOs need community-based organizing. So what can NGOs do to make sure they have that base they need? And so I'm going to ask you a question. I'm not putting anyone on the spot, but please raise your hand if you've ever worked or if you currently work for any funded animal freedom NGO or large organization. A fair few of you. Now keep your hands up, sorry. I'm not going to make you come up and dance or anything, don't worry. Amongst those of you with your hands up, keep your hand up if you're aware at any point of working in that organization of a member of the public reaching out to the organization with an email or a question along the lines of, I saw your latest investigation. I was so horrified. What can I do to help? I think most of you have kept your hands up there. I think for those of us, you can put your hands down now, thank you. But for most of us, I think we may have even been the person sending that message in, right? And so now, those of you who had your hands up, or if you sent a message in, I want you to think what the response that person got was. Was it something like, you can join our mailing list, you can send us a donation, you can sign our latest petition? In other words, was it asking that person to essentially become a spectator in your activism, your organization, in our movement? Or was the response something more like signposting to a local community-based animal freedom group? Was it sending a stack of stickers they could put up in their communities? Was it sending a guide perhaps on how to organize a protest or a public meeting? Were they invited to become a participant in our movement? And it's a big difference, and it's one I want everyone in here to think about, is how do we encourage members of the public to become active in our movement rather than just participating and feeling that's the only space they have? So these are kind of random pictures that I picked out of the latest newsletter of my local community-based animal freedom group, Dorset Animal Action. We're based down on the south coast in Dorset, surprisingly. And I just want to kind of share some of what's going down here. So, you know, it's a fairly diverse mix of things. I think we have some fly posting happening here against our local oceanarium. We have a protest here against animal testing. We have a liberation that happened just before Christmas of some turkeys. There's much more going on. This probably gives a slightly skewed version. We have vegan meetups, we have a chess club, we have all kinds of different events taking place. But I think this is going at what we can do as individuals for the grassroots movement. Because the most important thing for all of us to remember is all of us live in a community. All of us live somewhere. And in that somewhere, we should be, and if we want to be successful in a mass movement, we must be the grassroots, the community-based organizers within our hometowns, within our cities, within our counties. And I know it's often, you know, we're all very busy people and it can be hard, but there is such a plethora of different things we can be doing. We can be putting up stickers, we can be doing the direct action, the protest. We can also be doing fundraising, we can be doing research, we can be doing outreach. There's so many things every one of us can do, and all of us have something we can bring to the table. We all have a USP, something unique that we can bring to our local group to make it as effective as possible. And yes, we all have jobs. It's hard to find time to do this amongst our everyday life, our hobbies, our jobs, our families. But our local group down in Dorset, we have teachers, we have dentists, we have computer programmers, graphic designers, we have scientists, we have all kinds of different people with different jobs who find the time on their days off, their weekends, before work, after work, to do something to help our local community. The person in the beagle costume in the middle is actually the vice president of an international animal freedom NGO taking action on their day off. So all of us can and should be doing activism within our local communities if we want to see those communities exist. And if we want to be effective, we need those communities to exist. And so I want to kind of start rounding off on hopefully a positive note. I want everyone to leave this conference feeling excited, knowing that we can make change, because rebellions are built on hope. Thank you. And so Rocky the Dolphin, we've talked about the end of dolphinariums in the UK, ended in 1993 through the collaboration of grassroots activism and NGOs. So let's talk about fur farming, banned in 2001 in the UK. And why was it banned? It was banned once again because of a collaboration. Perhaps one of the most unlikely, certainly unplanned collaborations in the history of our movement. But throughout the 1990s, mink farms, fur farms across the UK were getting raided by the Animal Liberation Front to such an extent that the fur farmers bit the hand off the government when they offered them a deal that was proposed by Compassion in World Farming and other welfare organizations, that they be subsidized to close their farms. So this collaboration could not have happened without the Animal Liberation Front pressure, the pressure of local community-based organizing through protests, and the animal welfare movement, creating that pathway to actually seeing a realistic end to this industry. The live export of farmed animals banned just last year, one of our most recent major successes, ended finally because of legislation pushed through Parliament with the thanks of animal freedom NGOs. But it only got to that point because of public pressure spanning back decades, back to the Battle of Brightlingsea, when middle class, ordinary members of the public sat in their houses, saw cattle trucks running past their windows on their way to ferry ports to transport these animals to death on the European continent. These people were so horrified. In Brightlingsea, 1,000 members of the local community came out onto the streets, blocked the lorries, rowed boats out to sea to stop ferries leaving the port. Up in Coventry, at Coventry Airport, Jill Phipps, a hero of our movement, was murdered under the wheels of a live export lorry while protesting. This is decades of public pressure coming from the community-based organizing, coming from the grassroots and shifting public opinion to the point that NGOs were able to impact that in government policy. Once more, that collaboration was essential. A very similar story for wild animals in circuses, banned in 2019 in this country. Finally, once more, after decades of community-based organizing, going way, way back, almost to the birth of our modern movement. Local grassroots community groups across the UK, every time the circus came to town, in the words of Conflict, what goes up must come down. The tents were ripped down, the posters were ripped down, there was protest, there was publicity stunts, there was mass public rallying, getting the public on side against and in opposition to the use of wild animals in circuses. And finally, because it became such a distasteful idea for the British public, because of those protests, because of that negative publicity on the street, it got banned in 2019. Now, this is a story that is, honestly, I think most of you are going to be truly horrified and shocked. I know some of you know this story already, but those of you who don't, this is, I think, incredible. And it's a success that I think we don't even know most of us happened in this movement. How many people knew that in 1980, as recently as 1980, there was organized puppy snatching gangs that would steal up to hundreds of dogs a month from counties in the UK to be sold into British laboratories. I know you know because you gave me the picture, but not many of us knew that. And it's truly shocking. It came to light with the Northern Animal Liberation League, and we have genuinely, I think, a legend of the movement over here, Catherine. I'm going to make her have a round of applause. Please give Catherine a round of applause for this. So the Northern Animal Liberation League entered laboratories owned by the University of Sheffield, and they recovered a number of dogs, including Blackie here. And it was very clear very quickly that Blackie was a companion animal, that she had lived in a loving human household. She knew how to sit, how to give her paw. She reacted well to humans in a way that dogs in laboratories don't often react. And so the Northern Animal Liberation League, a community-based grassroots organization, they reached out to the media, did an appeal, and they were able to reunite Blackie with her family. An incredible moment in itself, but just the beginning of unraveling this sinister network of puppy snatching in collaboration with the Animal Liberation Front and also community-based organizers. They were able to undermine this entire secretive, illegal industry and put an end to the theft and use of domestic companion dogs in research laboratories. More dogs in laboratories. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this picture. Sol used it and you had a much better quality version of it, but Sol used this in her talk earlier. These are what became known as the ICI smoking beagles. In the ICI laboratories, these dogs were forced to inhale cigarette smoke in disgusting tests that really showed just how abhorrent we can be as a species. It was exposed by a national newspaper. A worker, a journalist, snuck into the laboratory, got a job in the laboratory with a hidden camera, got this photo, and for many people in this country, this is the first picture they ever saw from inside a British research facility. It caused mass public outcry. It caused 1 million school children to write letters to this company demanding they end this practice. It inspired 2 men to break into this laboratory in the dead of night and liberate 2 dogs named Major and Noddy. In fact, I think the first liberation of dogs from a laboratory in this country. And that brought more publicity. And as a result of this growing public pressure, this grassroots community organized pressure, combined with the media, the government in this country agreed to stop all licensing of smoking experiments on dogs. A very similar story again for the testing of cosmetics on animals. This is decades of grassroots, street level protesting, activism, allowing national NGOs to step in and secure in 1997 a ban on the cosmetic testing of animals, inspiring the European Union to follow suit shortly after. The same again with using great apes in research, experimenting on great apes, thanks to the incredible work of Jane Goodall, leading to the public outcry, working with the media, banned by NGOs. And as for hunting, for what it's worth, the Hunting Act 2004 only became possible after decades again of activists, hunt saboteurs, hunt monitors, community organizers out in the fields, out on the streets, gathering evidence of violence, changing public opinion, creating a culture in which this is not acceptable, allowing NGOs to step in and force through the Hunting Act 2004. And now many years later, we found ourselves in a position where hopefully we will get real legislation that affects real change for our wildlife. So every single one of those victories, firstly, we need to hold them in our hearts. We need to know that change is possible. Change is inevitable if we believe in it, if we fight for it, if we unify as a movement, and if we celebrate, support, and cultivate our grassroots and our community-based organizing. Now, I am going to finish here with a quote. It's from 2004, so it's a little dated, but it's from this professor, Wes Jameson, PhD, a professor from a leading American university in animal agriculture. He made this quote in 2004 to a room of representatives from the pig farming industry. These people were meeting at the height of the international SHAC campaign aiming to close down Europe's largest animal testing laboratory. The reason they were meeting at that time was because they were terrified, absolutely terrified, that when we closed down that laboratory, when we closed down every other laboratory in Europe and the US, we were coming for them. And they probably weren't wrong. But what Wes says, I think this is quite an interesting quote. It gives an insight into the other side. And I think it starts with something that's pretty accurate historically, that every 30 years or so, the animal rights movement gains incredible strength, and then it falls away. But every time the movement comes back since the 1890s, it's got stronger, it's cyclical, it ratchets forward every time it comes back. There will be no end to this. You, the pig farming industry, all industries of oppression, are in for the long twilight struggle. So what's interesting, I think, about this quote is that while he said this in 2004, the wave of the SHAC campaign, the last big rise of our movement, was only 15 years ago. So as we are here, poised at the next big moment in our movement, we are halfway ahead of schedule. We're 15 years ahead of schedule. So that's incredible in itself. But what we need to make sure as a movement is we aren't waiting 30 years. We aren't waiting 15 years. That we ensure these successes, these victories, these peaks in our movement do not go away. And to do that, we have to do the two things I have spoken about today. I'm sure many other things too, but specifically, we need to unify. We need to work together. We need to collaborate. We need to find those shared goals, as Rose talked about. We need to find moments and campaigns and ideas and initiatives that we can collectively get behind, and we need to cultivate our grassroots. And when we do that, we will prove to Wes, we will prove to the pig farming industry, we will prove to all industries of oppression that there is an end to this, that we can make this twilight struggle into a new dawn for every single animal on this planet. Thank you.